Samuel Cunard is buried in a London cemetery. Strange, really, for although he lived here, it's the city that figures least in the story of his life. Halifax, Boston, New York, Liverpool, Southampton, from these ports the great Cunarders came and went. Cunard dreamt that one day you would be able to set your watch by these huge ships as they crossed the North Atlantic. He died 25 years after the company's first sailing, and he left behind the most remarkable shipping line in the history of the sea. Sir Samuel Cunard's grave says a lot about him. He liked things plain and simple. While his competitors were installing marble bathrooms with gold taps in their ships, Cunard just carried on, offering a no-frills service, linking the old world with the new. And he was right. His competitors have long since ceased to exist. But the service that Samuel Cunard started 150 years ago is still going strong.
This ship cost £33 million in the late 1960s. The cost of a new one would be 3, 4, even £500 million, and I don't believe you could find anywhere in the world that could build one.
Sir Nigel Brokes, chairman of Trafalgar House, the company that bought Cunard in 1971, when it seemed the Great Line might go out of business.
It wasn't carelessness, they were just too small a business to survive on their own, and they weren't making money fast enough to replace their assets. The North Atlantic trade had disappeared with the advent of the jet, and many other companies were in trouble, but none as prestigious as Cunard.
Sir Nigel is not the sort of man given to emotion, but he claims that as well as making financial sense, Trafalgar liked the thought of saving a national institution with a household name.
I'm absolutely certain in 150 years' time Cunard will be as famous as it is today. The name is immortal.
If Sir Samuel Cunard walked on now on this flying deck, would you be able to face him and say, look, we've looked after the Cunard tradition?
Oh, I think we'd have a lovely time, and I'd stay with him the rest of the day. I'd be very pleased to see him. But his business, you see, was very much to do with mail, and Cunard, right up until the early 1900s, relied considerably on government subsidies for carrying the Royal Mail, and then for making their boats convertible to carrying armaments.
Samuel Cunard began life as a Tory in Philadelphia, where his family lived. And once the War of 1812 began, he went north and settled in Halifax, where he and his father initially worked in the dockyard at Halifax and ultimately established their own shipping line.
John Maxton Graham, an Englishman living in New York, is a world authority on Cunard. His books remind us that Samuel Cunard wanted to carry the mail and nothing else.
Formerly, the mails were carried by what were known as coffin brigs. Coffin brigs because they often didn't get where they were intended, and it took at least 6 weeks for a letter to get from Liverpool to Boston. So in this event, he built 4 ships, sailing steamers, And they departed on a rigorous schedule starting on the 4th of July in 1840. And Cunard was initially only interested in the mails. He didn't care about passengers. Passengers weren't even mentioned in the original Admiralty mail contract. I just read it last summer. And not a word about passengers. But what he cared about was the safe, efficient transport of the mails. Passengers could come if they wished, but he was involved with the mails, and that was his bread and butter to begin with.
Cunard's mail service would cost the British Admiralty £55,000 a year. Even so, the price of ships forced Cunard into a partnership with two Scottish merchants, George Burns, who was offered the Glasgow agency, and David McIver, who took on Liverpool. They put up the money, had shares in the ships, and called it the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. Everyone else called it Cunard's Company. Amongst their early passengers was a 30-year-old author, Charles Dickens, who sailed with his family to Boston. Of his cabin, Dickens wrote, "It was a long, narrow apartment like a gigantic hearse with windows in the sides."
Life on board those early steamers was rather rigorous, but such an advance over sailing ships. Although in a curious way, a steamer had less stability than a sailing ship, because the press of sails on a full-rig sailing ship kept the ship at a certain fixed position in the water. With less sails and paddle wheels, you were more inclined to be tossed about.
If we look at a model of Britannia, we can see that she was quite small, about the size of the Cutty Sark in London, in fact. She was a paddle steamer with a wooden hull. The sails were very important as a means of propulsion, partly because engines were not particularly reliable, and it was always wise to have a second means of getting the ship home.
We are at the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool with the assistant curator, David Williams.
By 1855, with ships like the Persia, Cunard were able to carry far more passengers. This ship is much more powerful. The sails proportionately form a less important part of her drive power. The company was involved in the carriage of emigrants from the old world to the new, and there would be several hundred steerage passengers enjoying rather cramped conditions below deck, and a far smaller number of first-class passengers in individual cabins. During these decades, during the middle of the last century, ship construction moved from wood into iron and then steel. The paddles slowly disappeared and the propeller began to take over. The sails became less and less contributory. They became very minor vestigial additions by the end, when engines were so reliable that they became unnecessary. And the final development, of course, was the introduction of twin screws, where there were two sets of engines, two propellers, and that was sufficiently reliable for the sails to be dispensed with.
Cunard's greatest enemy was ice. On the Atlantic it threatened his ships, in port it threatened his timetable. And when Britannia got stuck in the ice at Boston, the Bostonians cut a channel to the sea and presented the Honourable Samuel Cunard with a cup. It's still crossing the Atlantic, incidentally, in one of the restaurants on the QE2. In England, Liverpool watched the Cunard ships come and go. This was where the old world met the new, and vice versa. At the pier head, between the Liver Building and the offices of the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board, Cunard built their headquarters, which opened in 1917. Here was the Cunard Steamship Company expressed in bricks and mortar, solid, reliable, safe, with an understated elegance. The head office left Liverpool for London in 1967, but the Cunard building, now owned by the Prudential, will probably stand forever, a monument to the days when Liverpool was Britain's port of empire.
Samuel Cunard chose Liverpool as his home port from the very beginning. But Liverpool was in fact well established by 1840. The emigrants trade had begun to gather momentum, and passenger activity was quite pronounced here. Between 1830 and 1930, something like 9 million people passed through Liverpool on their way from Northern Europe to the New World, to North America and to Australia primarily. People emigrated for a variety of reasons. Some of them went because of poverty, and the Irish at the time of the potato famine are a good example of that. Others went because of religious persecution. The Jewish populations of Eastern Europe in particular are a prime case. And others again went for more positive reasons, out to the gold rush in California or Australia, or out to ranches. Maybe there were farmers in this country and they were going out to a much more prosperous life. So some of them, I'm sure, wondered whether they had done the right thing and perhaps they would never see their families again. Others went with a great deal of confidence and made great successes of the new life. This was the largest mass movement of people yet seen on Earth. I mean, never before, nor indeed since, have so many millions of people moved such vast distances in order to settle new lands.
Lunch is served on board the QE2 with a group of retired captains. Donald Maclean, who joined Cunard in 1917 and later captained the Queen Mary. Geoffrey Marr, last captain of the Queen Elizabeth, the man who delivered her to her final resting place in Hong Kong Harbour. Bill Warwick, who oversaw the construction of the QE2 and became her first master. And Peter Jackson, torpedoed in World War II, back in action 40 years later when he took the QE2 to the Falklands. They are all, in their own way, descendants of Henry Woodruff, the master of Cunard's first sailing steamer Britannia. These were national figures, and many of them were knighted. Sir Arthur Rostrum, whose tiny ship Carpathia steamed at full speed to reach the survivors of the Titanic. Sir James Charles, who entertained his passengers on the Aquitania with roast antelope. When he died in 1928, his funeral, like those of other Cunard Commodores, was an event of national importance.
They really were, you know, supreme beings to me as a junior officer. They looked almost like gods, so to speak. In those days, those pre-war days, the Queen Mary was operating at 30 knots across the Atlantic without any of the modern navigation aids and no radar or anything like that. And so one senior officer I used to sail with one time was sucking his pipe on the bridge. He said, "You know, Ma," he said, "this isn't right." He said, "Someday somebody's going to buy it," because with the speed of the ship, the only way we had of detecting the presence of other ships was listening for their fog signals. So we had to look out on the forecastle head, a look out in the crow's nest, an officer on each wing of the bridge, and the only thing you could do if you heard another ship's whistle was to turn 20 degrees away from it, hold that course for 10 minutes, then resume your course. I felt that I had a great deal to live up to when I saw them from a very junior position, and eventually I achieved that position myself. But some of these captains, they were such remote figures. But later on in life, I found that they could be great friends as well. And I found that the advice that I received from many captains stood me in good stead during the time when I became master of Cunard Line passenger ships.
We were afraid of the captain, but my captain had a tremendous propensity for chewing tobacco. And in fact, my most definite memory of the fact what a mess he made of the bridge with spitting out tobacco juice. And the other cadet and I had to clean it all up. And the first realization that he was about was arriving on the bridge and spitting, and he always hit the compass. The bottom of the compass was a dolphin, a brass dolphin, and he chewed his tobacco and spat it with absolute precision, hit the dolphin in the eye.
The fine seamanship of captains like Sir Edgar Britton became a legend, and every boy who went to sea dreamt of joining Cunard.
To me, the Cunard Line was the greatest passenger ship company I had ever heard of, and to be able to join such a company was, to me, a matter of great prestige. And the fact that I was accepted to join this company was beyond belief.
I just passed my examination as a master mariner, and I had to make up my mind about the future. And I had a very good friend in the Cunard Choice Pilot in Liverpool, and he said, Cunard are wanting officers, why don't you go there? Personally, I thought it was hopeless because I always regarded the Cunard as the Navy, sort of, you know. I was a backwoods boy. If you were in a company like Cunard, you were generally thought of perhaps being a little toffee-nosed, you know.
Samuel Cunard put safety before speed and told his captains to do the same. The rule books became bigger, just like the ships for which they were written, and by the 1890s, passenger liners were on the verge of a floating industrial revolution.
And then, of course, Charles Parsons, also exactly at that same time, perfected the marine steam turbine, a very small, powerful, extremely fast and efficient new kind of motive power. It meant more propellers, so ships suddenly had 4 instead of 2, but it also meant increased speed, increased economy, and increased efficiency. And 10 years after the Turbinia, which was his first turbine-driven vessel, the little experimental vessel, had sailed successfully, 10 years later, Lusitania and Mauretania entered service, both driven by these revolutionary turbines, largest ships in the world, and they swept the seas. They were not smooth rides. People seem to think that the minute you get a big ship, it's necessarily conquers all the waves. It doesn't at all. Sometimes they're more subject to different kinds of motion. So Lusitania and Mauretania weren't luxurious in that sense, but again they were built again with speed and reliability in mind. And of course they had 4 funnels, which none of the other ships in England up to that time had had.
Cunard had a tradition of giving their ships up for war. Sir Samuel got his knighthood because of it. But in the First World War, the Lusitania continued to carry civilians. When she was sunk by a German U-boat off the old Head of Kinsale on the way into Liverpool, the world was outraged. She went down in 20 minutes with the loss of 1,200 lives, many of them American, and the sinking did more than anything to bring the United States into the war. Young Alice Lines was a children's nurse in service with a British family returning home. She will never forget the afternoon of May the 7th, 1915.
I got eventually up to the deck, lifeboat deck. And by that time, there was a terrific second bang. The water came rushing in. My little boy was right up with water, and I was pretty wet too. A sailor came and grabbed Stuart, threw Stuart into a lifeboat just as it was being lowered. I went to follow, and he grabbed me back, and he said, "There's no room, it's full. There's plenty of room in the next boat. You must come in the next boat." And I, afraid I'd got a little bit hysterical, and I said, "But you've got my boy. I must go where my boy is." So I eventually got myself free from this man, and I jumped. And as I jumped, the lifeboat that my steward was in, I was in between him and the water. And the lifeboat got to the water as I got to it, actually. Well, I had very long hair, and it was flying. And so somebody grabbed my hair from the lifeboat and tipped me upside down, baby and all, into the lifeboat. It was a suction. And we couldn't get out. The suction of that large liner going down was trying to take us with it. But eventually we got free.
Stuart survived. So did the baby Alice Lines was clutching. But her under-nurse and Stuart's two sisters were never seen again.
2 days after, I think I'm right, we were sound asleep. It was the middle of the night. There was a tap on the door. And the lady in the house said, "I have a visitor for you." And it was the children's father had been picked up. But the mother of the children, it was about a fortnight before we found her. They found her in a deck chair, unconscious, just floating. She was bruised all over and had a broken wrist. They taken her to hospital a long way from Queenstown. That's why we didn't know where she was.
An inquiry was opened into the sinking of the Lusitania, the ship everyone thought was invincible. Alice Lines was amongst those who gave evidence. So was Captain Turner, who defended his decision to leave New York even though he'd been warned not to. For relatives of the missing, Cunard's letters said it all. We regret to state that no news has been heard of him since, nor does his name, up to the time of writing, appear on the list of identified dead. The Germans were ghoulish about the sinking. They struck a medal showing Cunard passengers queuing up to buy tickets from a skeleton. Alice Lines jokes about that now. Time has healed the wounds, but the sinking seems like yesterday.
Yes, all those years ago, I never, it's one of these things I've got always been, it's a nightmare. I can't think anything else. Yet, it's a miracle, isn't it, that I'm here.
Cunard wanted to operate their weekly transatlantic service with just 2 ships, 2 giants to be built at John Brown's shipyard on the Clyde. So in 1930 they laid the keel of a ship which, right up until the day she was launched, would bear only a number, Hull 534. Here was a ship to capture the blue ribbon on the Atlantic, and importantly for Cunard, the imagination of the British public. Looking back, this was a tremendous engineering achievement. 534 was over 1,000 feet long, 12 decks high, designed to carry 2,000 passengers, 81,000 tons of Ocean Express liner, which towered over the Clyde as a symbol of British prestige. But neither Cunard nor the workers on the Clyde had reckoned on the Depression and the problems of cash flow. Work stopped on 534 just before Christmas 1931, the most miserable Christmas Clydebank had ever known. For 2 years, Hull 534 sat rusting on the stocks. Longer than the Houses of Parliament, taller than Nelson's column, the public relations figures meant nothing to the families of the Clyde. Cunard's transatlantic express seemed doomed, until early in 1934, when the newspapers screamed the headlines everyone wanted to hear. The government loaned Cunard £3 million to complete 534 and promised another £5 million if a sister ship was built. There was one condition: Cunard must merge with its rival, the White Star Line, owners of the Titanic. The new company became Cunard White Star, and Hull 534 was to be their flagship. Still, no one knew what this monster ship would be called. The story goes that Cunard's directors told King George V they would name her after England's greatest queen. The directors were thinking of Queen Victoria. The king thought they were talking about his wife, which is why, on a rainy September day in 1934, Cunard found themselves with their first ever ship, whose name didn't end with the letters IA.
Named the ship the Queen Mary. I wish that all to sail in her.
Queen Mary was a very different ship. She was the first of the really grand ships. She was a very beautiful ship, very fast. She had stays up to the funnels, onto all the ventilators. All ventilators down into the engine room had wire stays to support it in heavy weather, and stays up to support the funnel. But the Queen Mary had a tremendous affection for the crew. They were very proud of themselves. Of course, she was the first of the big ships, and for a while she held the blue ribbon of the Atlantic.
It took 2 years to fit out the Queen Mary. Her maiden voyage to New York was in 1936. Those who went with her found a floating work of art, not quite as splendid as her rival, the French line's Normandy, but still impressive. Wood panelling, carvings, murals, the fabulous veranda grille and the immortal lookout bar, the Queen Mary was a floating superlative. Cunard promoted her as a wonder of the world, and they weren't exaggerating.
I arrived in Southampton to join the Queen Mary. The taxi dropped me at the head of the dock, and I stood there looking at this enormous bulk of a ship, towering, a forecastle head towering 60 feet above the sea, the height of a 10-story block of flats, an enormous bulk stretching into the distance. And in my youth, I just stood there and looked up at this in amazement and said to myself, my goodness, Geoffrey, how do you ever learn to drive anything as big as this?
With admiration when our new liner leaves the quay, and a name loved by the nation will give her charm and dignity. British labor gave it skill, and it's giving me a thrill, for I'm happy and gay 'cause I'm sailing away. I booked my trip for the USA on the finest ship in the world, the Queen Mary.
The Normandy had taken the blue ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing in 1935. The French were rather smug about it, but the Queen Mary brought it back to Britain in 1938. The Mary's last captain was Treasure Jones, an effervescent Welshman who had a lifelong love affair with Cunard's most famous ship.
Yes. Even though it was the only way to cross.
Yeah.
There must have been a thing of it was a fashion as well, wasn't it?
It was really, yes. People used to love crossing. particularly in the summertime. I don't know that.
She was a very fine ship, let's face it, and was right up till the end. And I think because she was the first that people had such affection for, possibly more than the Queen Elizabeth. When they first built the Queen Mary, they didn't put any rails in her, so they didn't think she was too big, she wouldn't roll or pitch, but they soon learnt their error. And she was a very rough ride with all the furniture sliding all around the ship and the passengers with it. And she used to roll over to 28 degrees in those days. I've known her go over 28 degrees before the stabilizers. So under those circumstances, they were quite an uncomfortable and alarming ride with a full gale behind you.
Nevertheless, if you wanted to get to New York, there was no alternative to going by sea. 2 years after the launch of the Queen Mary, work started at Clydebank on hull 552. But this time there was no secret. Everyone knew she would be called the Queen Elizabeth. Though she was the Mary's sister, she had 2 funnels instead of 3 and was altogether more sophisticated. And although war was only a year away, the new ship was optimistically painted in peacetime colours when she was launched in September 1938.
Her Majesty the Queen had come to bestow her own name upon the towering beauty whose graceful hull lay ready on the slipway. And again the thousands packed the yards, climbed the jibs, and trained to see the biggest ship in the world take the water. A floating city of nearly 84,000 tons, built to consolidate and secure British supremacy on the most important of all ocean routes, the Queen Elizabeth.
Name her Queen Elizabeth.
When Britain declared war on Germany, the Elizabeth was still being fitted out. Her sister was on the way to New York, and the fate of the merchant fleet was uncertain. In March 1940, Cunard summoned a scratch crew, engineer Willie Farmer was amongst them, and told them to report to Glasgow. The word was that the Queen Elizabeth, hurriedly completed, was being moved to join the Queen Mary in Southampton. The instructions to Willie Farmer were precise, but shrouded in secrecy.
When I'd been called into the office at Liverpool, they told me that I was due for leave. I'd been away for nearly a year, cruising from New York, and I said, they told me they wanted me to go to Clydebank. I had a suspicion what it was all about, but I didn't actually protest, but I did say, but I haven't had any leave for nearly a year. And they said, well, don't worry about that, because you're only going away for a few days. As soon as I got on board the ship and spoke to 1 or 2 of the young engineers, there was no doubt about it. We all knew where the ship was going. She wasn't going to Southampton, she was going to New York. And I said, but I don't have the gear to go away on a longer voyage than a few days. They said, don't worry, you're not the only one. There's a lot of us in the same boat. The telegraph rang from stop to standby. And I went up on the platform to see the second engineer, and he'd said, well, we'll be off shortly. And then, being standby, more engineers came down to do the manoeuvring. And off we went, we sailed. This was a tremendous ship. She was machinery from the bow to the stern, 2 or 3 decks of it. And there's been no engine trials, and not a thing went wrong, to my knowledge. That was the most amazing thing about the whole operation. I've been on new ships arriving in New York and inaugural cruises around the world, but nothing was like the reception we got arriving in New York. had a few good days in New York, wherever you went, you were welcomed and almost a celebrity.
Within months, the Queens went to war, doing what they did best, carrying passengers. From Sydney, the Mary ferried Australian troops to the Middle East. In 1941, she was joined by the Queen Elizabeth, and together they trooped around the Empire. In 1942, they supplied reinforcements to the 8th Army in North Africa.
In those days, they slept some men out on deck, and the promenade decks, which had been turned into enormous dormitories, couldn't be used in the winter. It was too cold, because there's no way of heating them. So in the winter loads, they would cut down the loads, but in the summertime, entire regiments used to sleep out on deck. And those who had a bunk below played what was called hot sack. They'd have the bunk for half a day, then they'd get out and somebody else would have it. And they slept in that infamous U.S. Navy invention called the standee bunk. And the thousands of ex-GIs and ex-servicemen from all over the Commonwealth these days, who, if you say the word standee bunk, will remember very well Passage on a Wartime Queen.
The Queens relied on their speed to keep them out of trouble. No escort could keep up with them anyway. They were told never to stop, and when in October 1942 the Queen Mary sliced through her escorting destroyer, HMS Curacao, she just kept on going.
Of course, it was always in your mind that a tin fish could come through the side of the ship. If you could be on top, you had a certain amount of safety behind you, but every hour you spent down below, it was something to think about at the back of your mind.
The Queens seemed to be everywhere. Sydney, Fremantle, Cape Town, Trincomalee, Suez. In 1942, they were refitted to carry even more troops. And when, in the run-up to D-Day, the two ships started a New York shuttle, they carried 15, 16, 17,000 troops on a single crossing. 500,000 GIs and 64 Atlantic runs. Even in war, Cunard seemed determined to set new records. Winston Churchill used the Queens on his way to discuss strategy with President Roosevelt, and paid Cunard the greatest compliment. Through their trooping, he said, the superliners had shortened the war in Europe by a year. And when it was all over, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth took the GIs home. No U-boats to worry about, no gunnery practice, just 5 days to think about getting back to normality. Peacetime brought a new paint scheme for the Queen Mary. She'd been nicknamed the Grey Ghost during the war. There was that delayed maiden voyage for the Queen Elizabeth, and almost 20 years after they planned it, Cunard's two-ship express service to New York got underway. By 1950, passengers at Southampton were using the Ocean Terminal, a 1930s building which complemented the ships of the same era. So many people used it as a gateway between Britain and the United States that Cunard thought they'd discovered the secret of eternal prosperity.
It was a service that made a fortune for Cunard, and a great dollar earner, too, for the government was having terrible trouble right after the war. Suddenly to come down on those ships and get on board and see all the butter you could have, and see bread that was white instead of grey, and to have unlimited bacon and eggs and food. It was extraordinary. But they allowed them to have the best of everything because they knew this was a great dollar earner, because Americans, deprived of steamer travel during the war, suddenly all wanted to sail to Europe, and the Queens were ready for them. service on the Queen's initially was very, what I could describe as old school. It was very much pre-war service, the best of everything, flawlessly delivered, and there was a tradition of service. The men were the stewards who waited on you at table, or the stewards and stewardesses who looked after you in your cabins, had a marvelous Cunard style to them, which made passage on those Queens just something incredible. There was no way to improve on it.
We had no right. That's how easy it was at that period.
We used to be about a mile apart, but it was always a wonderful sight because these two huge ships, you know, pushing the North Atlantic aside in huge lumps and that, and the wind streaming through their rigging, passing each other at a combined speed of over 70 miles an hour, made a wonderful spectacle and was tremendously popular with the passengers. It was like being the manager of a large hotel which had about 2,000 guests, and also moving the whole place across the Atlantic and arriving on time, you know, no matter what the weather or anything like that. So it was a very responsible job, but a most enjoyable job because you met a large cross-section of the world and a very relaxed. They were no longer on duty. They were resting and relaxing, and you could have long, interesting conversations with very well-known people in that calm, relaxed atmosphere.
In that period, everybody who was anybody traveled in the Queens. It doesn't matter what nationality they were, there were big government officials from all nations, all the big businessmen, chairmen of businesses going to start new business again after the war, the actors, the actresses, all the big sportsmen. I remember some of those golfers of that period there was such a rush.
Didn't like to fly, and that was Hermione Gingo. And she was a great actress and great foil. She always sort of reminded me of stories that I used to tell and things like that.
Other regular passengers were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
At the time I was the junior navigating officer, and I was on the bridge between 8 and 12 in the morning, and of course at 8:30 she used to give the bridge a ring, and I used to answer it, and she used to ask what the weather was, and I was all duly prepared and used to tell her that it was going to be either wet or fine, and so that she would know what clothes to wear.
The liners had a list of regular travellers, but some wealthy passengers actually lived on board, only going ashore when the ship was in dry dock.
Well, there was one particular one who lived on board the ship. That was Miss Clara Macbeth, and she was an American lady. When I knew her, she was quite old. She had a home in New York, number 1 Fifth Avenue, as I recall, and but she spent her time on board the ships. Presumably she could afford to do so, and she enjoyed the ships. But I think more than the ships, she enjoyed the company of the crews of the ship. Seems a rather strange thing to say, but she was quite a lonely old lady. she would board with her companion. Her companion would have the adjoining cabin. And she very seldom ventured out.
It was quite amusing, really. You know, you'd just say, "Good morning, Miss Macbeth. Are you going ashore today?" "Where are we, young man?" she used to say. And you'd say, "Oh, Sydney." "Oh, no, I was there in 1938. I don't think I'll bother going." Well, you knew what the answer would be every time, but it was quite amusing.
Miss Macbeth lived on board Caronia, Cunard's newest ship, launched in 1949 by Princess Elizabeth. 4 years after the end of the Second World War, she was the last word in comfort, and she was designed for cruising.
Now, the Caronia sort of was the bellwether ship. There had been cruises, round-the-world cruises, before the war, between the wars, on the Laconia and Franconia. But the Caronia was painted bright green. She was called the Green Goddess. And it was an incredible PR touch, because it distinguished the ship at once. She had a Cunard funnel, same orange and black funnel, so it was no mistaking which company owned her. But her hull in 3 shades, hull and superstructure in 3 shades of green, instantly identified her.
Caronia was really, in my opinion, probably my opinion, this is a seaman's dream. She was a beautiful ship, about 30,000, 33,000 tons. She wandered around the world very gently, no excessive speeds, 20 knots comfortably. My kids used to be asked where their father was, and they used to say, well, he's on his yacht cruising around the world. And I used to consider myself
Just the Queen Mary sail. I said, never had a ship such a send off. I said, a ship has such a receipt and
The future for the Queen Elizabeth was much more sinister. She slipped out of Southampton in 1968, no fanfares, no goodbyes, and went to Florida. There she stayed for 2 years, shipping merchant. See why took her on and planned the floating university. The world saw the Queen was as a burning wreck in Hong Kong harbor. Victim of 6 mysterious fires. How would Cuba